Welcome to Messy Modern Ministry, a resource where we equip leaders to navigate the ups and downs of ministry in our modern world. My name is Kristen.
And I'm Joe.
And we are so excited to have you join us today.
On this episode, we have Pastor Mike Jankowski, lead pastor of the Harbor Church on Long Island. He's been a minister for 35 years, starting in Michigan, moving to Hackensack, New Jersey, and then finishing off, so far, the 18 years on Long Island, New York. So, Pastor Mike, welcome to the episode. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. I'm just so honored to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm looking so forward to the conversation that we're going to have, and hopefully it'll encourage someone.
So, Pastor Mike, tell us a little bit about your ministry, how you got started, where you came from 35 years ago, you little young buck. How'd you get into ministry? What drew you?
That's a great question. I gave my heart to Christ in 1981, and I went 1 year to Bible college just a couple of years later, and I was in the plumbing field, working in plumbing, and I started noticing that when I was on the job site or whatever, I was thrilled to lead people to Christ or pray with them, or, and I started to realize, hey, there's something to this. I love helping people. I always had a heart for the streets. I always had a heart for the unchurched, and because I came from that background. I got saved at 18, but I was messed up with alcohol and drugs, and come from a very abusive home life. So my heart was always for the underdog. And then due to some family circumstances, I had two half sisters that I had to raise. And so I wasn't able to go back to Bible college. So I thought, well, I'm going to be a plumber the rest of my life. And I was willing to do what I had to do for my family. And then one day my pastor, who was an older man, came and took me to lunch and basically said, hey, there's a call on your life. We all see it. I've got a group of junior highs that nobody wants to lead the group because they're rowdy and, they're a crazy bunch. And I have a maintenance position open, and I'll pay you $90 a week. I was making like 300 and something at the time in plumbing. I'll pay you $90 a week if you'll be our maintenance man, and you'll take this junior high group and then finish your schooling through correspondence. And I didn't even really have to pray about it because I knew what my passion was. And so that's what I did. And I took that junior high group, which ended up being just an amazing experience. And some of those junior highs today are pastoring around the country, and I've had the privilege of speaking in their churches.
So, Pastor Mike, you mentioned a little bit before that you were 18 when you met the Lord, and that you had a little bit of a struggle before then, a little bit of a struggle with addiction and alcohol and drugs. And so we really want to talk about that and your experience and how you've dealt with that in your own life, as well as walking people through that in your ministry and still leading them to Christ.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about it. We had a broken home growing up. My parents were divorced when I was about 5, and my mother had remarried, and my stepfather was a very violent alcoholic physically. And my father was an alcoholic as well, but never physically abusive to me. So there was that one was kind of more emotional, where another one was more physical. And so there was just some crazy stuff that we, witnessed growing up. And it was myself. I was the oldest. My brother, who was 2 years younger, him and I were best friends because we went through so much together. And then I had two half sisters. So it wasn't uncommon in our home to, over the weekends to have my stepfather just beating my mom, to a pulp in the middle of the night, as I got older and I started to speak to that, it started happening to me because I was the oldest. So when I was about 12, and it's crazy, the very thing that I hated about what was going on in our family, and I felt trapped as a kid, I would always say, I just can't wait to get old enough to move out so I don't have to, but I just heard a quote recently that said, what walks in you runs in your kids. So the very thing that I despised and hated about our family, which was the alcohol abuse, which, by the way, now that I've been able to track it, went back generations. Everyone all the way back were alcoholics, all the way from in Europe, where my family's all have come from. So at 12 years old, I started smoking weed and started drinking, and just to numb the pain, and the whole time I would lay at night in bed and say, God, if you're here, why is all this stuff happening? Blah 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 blah. And I always felt that there was something out there, but I just didn't know what it was, because we really weren't raised in church per se. And then for me, what really elevated everything to another level was when I was 16. My mom at the time was 36, going on 37. She was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And when she died, I just went into a tailspin. And I ended up living on my own, believe it or not, at 16. And for 2 years, I drank myself into oblivion every night. I smoked a lot of marijuana. I never did cocaine, or these are the days before crack and all of that. I never wanted to be addicted to heroin, but I did just about everything else you could do. And if I would have stayed in that life long enough, I probably would have done whatever was available. So I went on a 2-year binge and was just suicidal. I was so discouraged and depressed. And then when I was 18, I had just graduated from high school, and I barely graduated. I just barely got through. And I received a graduation card in the mail from a woman that I had met at my mother's funeral. And this woman had been friends with my mom in high school, and they had lost touch over the years. And she had found out through somebody that my mom was sick, and ended up visiting my mom in the hospital several times. And in that, she sent me a graduation card. And I was getting ready. I was going through all the cards to go out partying that night. And I opened this card, I had a stack of cash on my bed and some checks, and the cash was going with me that night, if you know what I mean. And as I'm reading the card, I remember this woman. She was really nice. And then in the middle of whatever she wrote, I have the card in my desk right now, by the way, in my office. I've kept it all these years. And she said in that card, in parentheses, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. And that one verse jumped off the page at me so much that I just started to weep. And I didn't know what was wrong with me. And that was the beginning of me coming to Christ. So I reached out to her. We started having conversation. And within about 3 months, I had given my heart to Christ. I had found out that she had led my mom to Christ in the hospital, and I didn't even know that. So when I came to Christ, again, having an extremely addictive personality, and I'm not typical, because I know that so many have a difficult time with addiction, and they have to go into programs, and they have to go into Teen Challenge and other Christian programs. I never did. Praise God. I mean, right out of the gate, I got into God's word. I was in church every time the doors were open, because I knew what the other side was. And I knew that I just wanted to get as far away from that as I could. Over the years, those urges and temptations early on were still there. But the longer that I served Christ, and the longer that I went after him, those urges lessened. But I also know that for me, and I'm not speaking for anyone else, but for me, if I open that door even a little bit now, I know what's at stake. And I've just chosen all these years. It's been almost 40 years, 39 years that I've been serving Christ. And once in a great while, I'll still get that little, like, just go out and, but I thank God I haven't. So that's kind of part of my story. That's the short version of it. But yeah.
That's so encouraging that all that woman had to do was write one verse in a card. I think that's just an encouragement for all of us believers as well, that like, look how God has redeemed that situation. And what did it take? It took the obedience of a woman to buy a graduation card and write one verse in it. And so that's just amazing. I love that. And thank you for sharing that. You walked through such a terrible situation, which I'm sure at the time you would have never seen yourself where you're sitting today, right? You would have never seen how God redeemed it. And so, how has that situation helped you to guide people when they are coming to you walking through similar situations?
It's a great question. I got to tell you, prior to COVID, I would sometimes walk in on a Sunday morning, and I'm sit in the front row next to my wife, and I'd turn around and see the church, and I'd look up and go, are you sure you know what you're doing? Because I still look at myself as sometimes a plumber, that got saved and has a Bible, in his hand, and I would never want to go back and relive anything that I went through. However, in saying that, I think when you go through stuff, and we all go through stuff, that brings a certain credibility when you're speaking to people that are hurting. And would I trade it? I don't know if I would, because it has helped shape me into who I am today, in the sense of the empathy that I have for people. I can see people that are hurting, and my heart just aches and breaks, and it'll compel me to approach them or talk to them or whatever. I wouldn't want to change any of that. And I wouldn't want to have lived in a perfect, trouble-free environment. I don't know if I could identify with anyone at that point. So I think Romans 8:28, that verse is just so spot on, because whatever you go through in your life, God always works it out for his purpose. And did I see myself in New York, all these years later, and my son in the ministry, and my daughter serving God, doing ministry, my grandkids, singing about Jesus and loving it? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I never saw that. I dreamed about things early on, but God has just taken those dreams and just blown my mind and taken them 10 steps farther. So I think when it comes to people that are struggling, we all talk about accountability, and accountability is vital. And I had that, but accountability is no good if you're not vulnerable, and there's no relationship. You can't force accountability. So I had men in my life that I looked up to early on, and I could tell them, I'm struggling today. Like I'm wrestling with this today, and I feel like I'm going to give in. And I had guys they didn't judge me or condemn me. They were like, okay, I get it. That's fair. But let me pray with you. Let me walk with you. Let's go have coffee. And I believe that's what got me through. And I think that today, I think people need to understand that Christianity and this whole serving God thing is not just about the Sunday morning experience. Most of what should happen happens between Sundays. And that's the time where you're willing to be bothered, like taking a call from someone who's struggling at whatever time of the night or day, and investing in them. I think that's huge. So I think accountability is huge, but you have to be vulnerable enough to be willing to lay it all out there and say, I'm struggling. And don't worry about being judged. If you're around people that are going to judge you and condemn you, you're in the wrong place. So I think that's a big part of it. And people that I have kind of walked through things with, I will see them, and I'll tell them, I'm going to ask you how you're doing, and no one else in the crowd is going to know what we're talking about. But I'm going to look you in the eye, and I'm going to watch your reaction. And if you're not doing well, I'm going to know, and we'll get together and we'll connect. And so I think people appreciate that, because you're valuing them.
When somebody calls you and says, "Hey, I'm struggling with an addiction. I can't do it on my own anymore," what is the first step that you take to dealing with that?
I think sometimes it's hard for us to separate what the addiction does to people. A lot of times someone who's in a full-blown addiction, they're lying, they're stealing, all the things that go with that. Sometimes it's hard to separate what they're doing because of the addiction and who they are. And so, I try to model my ministry after what Jesus would have. He always valued people, like even the woman caught in adultery, he valued her as a person. And when he said to her, he wrote in this, we all know the story, and he didn't say, if you go and sin no more, I won't condemn you. He said, I don't condemn you. Now with the knowledge of that, go and sin no more. And there's a difference. And so I think people need to know that there's safety when they fail. And so I try to treat people with respect. If they have failed and failed miserably, I provide an atmosphere where it's safe for them to talk about that and own it. I think owning it is huge. And that's a good place to start, because then you can talk about options. You can talk about, what do we do from here? I've taken people to Teen Challenge myself. I've driven them there, those that needed that, those that are in other programs, and programs are great. And I think it's awesome. I didn't have to go, but I think if I would have been in that lifestyle any length of time past that, I probably would have had to go. So every case is individual, but I just try to treat people with respect. I don't care if they're sitting there and they have no teeth and they have blemishes because of the drugs they're taking. And I don't deal with this a ton, but I deal with it enough. I just try to treat everyone with respect. That's what Jesus did. And people respond to that. Love is the universal language. You can love someone and give them a hard word of correction. You know what I mean? And when you take the love element out, and it's a disaster.
First of all, you have these people that you are vulnerable and honest with, these people that you had looked up to, that you were honest and said, hey, I'm struggling, right? And now you've kind of taken it upon yourself when you see somebody. No, nobody else has to know what I'm asking you, but how are you doing? And I think that's so important, because I do think that sometimes with some topics, we almost act like if we don't bring it up, maybe it's not an issue, right? But for these people, just because I'm not bringing it up doesn't mean they're not walking through it. It just means they're walking through it alone and maybe ashamed.
Right. That is so true. And I don't know the percentage, but the percentage of men that deal with porn addictions. And that's not an easy thing to go to another man and say, I'm struggling with that, right? But if I say, oh, let me pray the demons out of you, and he's never going to come to you again. But if I can say, all right, well, you can't live there, okay? You can't live there. So let's work on a path to get you out of that. And even sometimes owning, like, you think you're the only one that struggles? You think you're the only one that's tempted with this or that? So I think being real and being vulnerable, and a lot of the guys that have come in have just said, I didn't expect that you have had the same temptations. And I'm like, oh, of course, yeah, but we're going to get healthy. We're going to get healthy together, and I'm going to walk with you. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of hurting people out there. And sometimes in the church world, we've made it to where it's just not easy for them to be real because of their fear of being judged or, ostracized or whatever. And we're here to bind up the brokenhearted and heal their wounds. And that's what Jesus did. And that's what we try to do. And one thing real quick, the name of your ministry is so great. I'm jealous because I would want to steal it. It's such a great name. But the reality is Christianity, especially those that are coming in, it's going to get messy. And you got to understand that it's not compartmentalized, clean. Everything's, and it's messy. And there's times I think, God, how in the world are you going to sort this out? Because, we make such a mess of our lives. And sometimes I just don't know. We had one situation where a marriage had been split up and the man was having an affair, was living with a woman. The wife was a godly woman. She ends up praying her husband back, right? And so prays her husband back. Wow. And they started coming here. And a couple of years later, this man looks over across the church, and the woman that he had been with had gotten saved, and her husband were here. And it was kind of like, what do we do? What do we do? And yeah, it was, stuff like that. You can't make this stuff up. This is the messiness of life, right?
I was
Right.
going to say, talk about messy.
That's something you can't learn in school. That's for
You
sure.
can't. You don't learn that in Bible college.
No way.
So, when somebody comes to you with this, you said one of the first things you think is important is ownership, right? And then you could talk about options. I'm sure, pray through it. I'm sure people look at programs. You've driven someone to Teen Challenge yourself. Have you ever found a situation where you were pouring yourself out, trying to help somebody, and came to a place where you realized that maybe they didn't want it?
Honestly, that is a great question. And I think that happens more often than not, unfortunately, to be real. The percentage of people that really are at a place where they want help is probably lower than those that just want to be enabled or aren't willing to change. And I have to be careful with my time, even because it's kingdom time. And if I find that someone's really not interested in wanting to change or get help, I have to scale back how much time I'm willing to spend with them until they're ready, until they're desperate. And so, yeah, great question. You have to be sick and tired of being sick and tired. You have to get to the place where I'm so desperate. And that's where I was at. I'm so desperate with this life. I will do whatever I have to do to be whole. And there are people that definitely come to you and they're at that place, but there are a lot that they're not ready yet. And unfortunately, and I've done way too many funerals for people that have died of overdoses or alcoholism that never got to that place, So it's sad. Yeah.
How do you, I don't know if there's really even a verbal answer for this, but how do you know when, okay, for my own time and even for your own emotional self, this person's just not ready and I need to kind of like protect my time and protect my heart? How do you get there, and what have you done to protect yourself from that?
Well, over the years, there's been people that I won't meet with anymore. I know that sounds cruel, but there was one situation where the family was a mess, the marriage was a mess, and this person would come in and I always, when I meet with people, I always give them, I guess you call them action points. Not that I call them that in the meeting, but I'll always say, look, okay, so this is what we're going to do. In the next few weeks, this is what I want you to do. I want you to write a letter to your wife expressing your heart and think it through, rewrite it a dozen times. And I want you to write a letter to your wife to start having conversation again. And I want you to do this and do this and do that. And if by the next meeting or the meeting after they haven't done that, then I know they're not serious. And so that happened in a situation where I told my office, I'm not meeting with them anymore. I've met with them 4 or 5 times. There's been zero effort. If they really want help, they would start. And so that's the hard part of ministry, where you say no, because I have to do that because there are people and there are situations that desperately need your help. And sometimes things come your way that can rob you of your kingdom time that's intended for someone else. So there's a certain level of discernment. And I got in trouble with a guy one time. He wouldn't work. He wouldn't work. And his wife had a professional job. She was paying all the bills, making great money. He was laying home on the couch, gaining weight, and he couldn't hold the job down because he knew everything. He was just an expert at everything. Couldn't hold the job down. And so he was buying all these toys like quads and Harley Davidsons, and his wife is supporting him, right? So he had me go to the diner one morning, and he was the guy that was always the most spiritual guy in the church. Like he would come to you with all of the you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so we're having breakfast at the diner, and he says, Pastor, could you give me a word in the spirit of what you're sensing And he had some complaints about his wife because his wife was wanting to put some of the money that he was spending in savings, and he didn't think that was right. Can you give me a spiritual word about, what we should do, bless God and, all of that stuff. And so I'm sitting there and my blood is boiling, and I gave him probably the most spiritual answer I could. I said, dude, you need to get off the couch and get a job because it's disgraceful. He goes to another church now, but but I told him what I felt like I should have told him. And so, sometimes people don't want to hear.
Right.
Jesus, remember Jesus said, I'm speaking on this week, the crippled beggar that was laying beside the pool of Bethesda, Jesus asked him, hey, do you want to get well? What a question. You think, well, of course he would. He's been a beggar. Jesus said, do you want to get well? And you know what? The beggar never answered him. And so I think that's the $10,000 question. Do you want to be whole? Do you want to get well? Do you want to be free? And T.D. Jakes said it best years ago. He said, we treat our sin like a friend. We defend it, we protect it. But the thing about a friend is you can't kill a friend. And I never forgot that. Like, when my sin is my friend, I'm not gonna kill it. I'm not gonna do away with it, And so you got to look at your sin as your enemy. It's out to kill you. And I never forgot that.
So when a situation like that happens, where you're meeting with somebody, they're not getting it, they don't want to change, you refuse to meet with them, there's fallout. There's always a fallout. Either they leave the church, they start talking bad on your name, they start making up all these different things. Obviously, they're still going through a real situation that they talk to you about, that you have to kind of keep under wraps. How do you defend yourself, so to speak, and continue being the minister you are without airing out all of their personal issues?
I learned long ago from my pastor that number one, you never have to defend yourself in the sense of, I think whenever people leave, it's always good to listen to what they're saying, because I always ask myself, is there any validity to what they're saying? Is there any truth in it? And if there's something that I could learn from that, or the way we're doing things, absolutely. So there are times where I've said, you know what? Yeah, maybe we could have done that differently. And I own it. That's part of being a good leader. In situations like that, where people maybe leave mad, I went and talked to, and I just have learned over the years that if I'm doing my job and I'm the kind of pastor and shepherd that I'm called to be, that I don't need to defend myself. And people that are worth their salt will come to me if they've heard something or struggling, and they say, hey, this is what I heard, what happened, or what can you share? And I can give them a very generic version of it. But I think that's the number one struggle for pastors, is when people get mad. Maybe they didn't like your counsel, or they get mad about something and they just blaze out on you. And then they start talking, they start getting other people involved. That's painful. And so that's a tough one. That's a whole nother topic.
Right.
And I'd like to listen to what others say on that one, because I don't know if I have that one figured out yet. So
I was going to say it's painful and unfortunately common.
Right.
To see that play out that way.
Yeah. Been there many times.
Just to kind of recap, I have a lot of takeaways. And one thing that I really want to just repeat is something that's so practical, but that when you are in meetings with people, you give them tasks, right? They have an action to take. And to me, as you said it, I thought, why have I never thought of that? But that's huge, because the thing is when you are dealing with people who aren't healthy yet, right? Who aren't free from whatever they're struggling with, they can come to you and put on a great face and almost convince you that they're working on it, or something came up, but they will. And so to have those tangible things, have you taken the first step that I asked you to, as a gauge if they're following your leadership, or if you're just wasting your time. Yeah. I hate to say that, wasting your time, because, pouring into somebody isn't, but for your own sake and for kingdom time, like you said, to be able to recognize this isn't going forward right now. To me, that's one thing that I'm like, I'm implementing that today.
Yeah. I mean, that's the only way we can gauge someone's willingness, right? And we always tend to minimize our weaknesses and struggles. You know, like mine compared to yours, like, oh, you're in bad shape, but I got a handle on mine. That's how we deceive ourselves. And funny story. So my wife and I have done a lot of counseling with marriages over the years. And so woman comes to my wife after a Sunday service and said, oh, our marriage is like, it's in such bad shape. I think it's over. I don't even know if we can recover. It's just in such bad shape. Can we meet with you? You know? And okay. And I run into the guy the same morning, not knowing this. And I just happen to say, hey, how's your family? How's your marriage? How's everything? Oh, pastor, never been better. Great. And two completely different. Right. And we really minimize things. And so that was an interesting conversation when we had both of them in there.
That's funny. So just to recap, if somebody comes to you, as for whoever is listening, if somebody's coming to you and you're a ministry leader and they're struggling with addiction, first, be vulnerable. Listen to them. Give them the respect that they deserve as a human being. Second, give them tasks. Give them things to work on, action items, so that you can hold them accountable for what they're doing when you're not together. And third, prioritize your kingdom time. If they're not willing to change and you're understanding that and you're discerning that, it is okay to cut out that meeting time, because that time can be used for somebody else who is willing to put in that work.
Jesus did that very thing, right? He would withdraw. He wouldn't entrust himself to everybody. That's huge.
Pastor Mike, thank you so much for your insight and your wisdom and for being on the show. We really appreciate it. If you guys would like to get in touch with Pastor Mike, you can visit their website at www.theharborli.com, or you can send him an email at pastor@theharborli.com. They also have locations in Patchogue and Santa Mauritius on Long Island, so feel free to visit them on a Sunday morning.
Yes, and if there's any complaints about the podcast or any negatives, would you guys give them your email so that they could send them directly to you and not to me?
No worries. We'll take the heat.
It's been a real honor today, you guys. Thank you. And thank you for just practical things. I think this is needed, and it's been a real honor.
Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to hear more, make sure you subscribe. Also, we would love to hear from you. So down below, you can leave us a review or a comment.
Yeah, and you can also follow us on Instagram or Facebook at MessyModernMinistry for any teasers or updates on future episodes. Have a great day, guys.
Bye.